All right, ladies and gentlemen. So today we're going to review our biology class. And let me get this set up right here. I thought I already did, but it doesn't matter. So today we talked about osmosis and diffusion, and we talked about mainly passive transport. So what we're going to do in this meeting, or in this video lesson, excuse me, is go over some of those important concepts. So let me start sharing my whiteboard in a minute. And hopefully this will help you guys for your next exam. So to kind of recap, we talked about the cell theory, we talked about cell organelles, we talked about cell membranes, and now we're going to talk about how things get in or get out of the cell. And more than anything, we're going to talk a little bit about uh, diffusion, osmosis, passive transport, facilitated diffusion, or facilitated transport, excuse me. So let's get started. So the first thing that is good for us to understand is that cells are continuously importing and exporting substances. We have to remember that our cell environments, or animal cell environments, or cell environments of any living organism, is a very dynamic environment. And what I mean by a very dynamic environment means it's not still. It's always constantly changing. Now, there are various ways in which cells um, there are various ways in which cells maintain homeostasis or maintain balance. Now, the reality is that because cells are always constantly importing and exporting substances, um, this process alone would require a lot of energy. So, in order, oops, let me see right here. Okay, give me 1 second. Okay, here we go. In order for cells to constantly import and export substances, in order for cells to constantly import and export substances without using energy, in order for cells to constantly import and export substances without using energy, without using energy, there are various processes such as osmosis and diffusion help move these substances. So cells are constantly moving substances across, and if it's something that never stops, so if they needed energy for this would be very, very, very detrimental. In fact, that means that cell life would be very, very short. So what they do, or what cells do, is they have different mechanisms to transport substances across the membrane without using energy. And that brings us to the first thing that we're going to talk about real quick. And we're going to talk about passive transport. Okay. So again, the cells are constantly importing and exporting substances. And in order for cells to constantly import substances without using energy, various processes such as osmosis and diffusion help move these substances. But what is osmosis and diffusion? Although we are going to talk about those in a couple of more minutes, let's talk about passive transport, because osmosis and diffusion are in reality types of passive transport. So let's first define what passive transport is. And passive transport can be defined as the movement of molecules across the movement. I'm sorry, the movement of molecules across the cell membrane without using energy. So basically, passive transport is defined. Fix this real quick. Is defined Passive transport is defined as the movement of molecules across the cell membrane without using energy. So, osmosis, diffusion, we're going to talk about those in a minute. But basically, what they do is they move nutrients or substances across the cell membrane without using energy. Okay, so they require no energy. And let's talk real quick about diffusion. Okay, so diffusion is a movement of molecules in a fluid or gas form Diffusion is the movement of molecules in a fluid or gas form. Excuse me for a second. In a fluid or gas form from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. To a region of lower concentration. Right? And it's always good to know um, that molecules diffuse from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. And that means, like, for example, someone puts on a perfume and then all of a sudden the smell just kind of dissipates. That's because perfume is in its fluid state. So it's basically when you spray it, you're having that smell move from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. Now, the way that molecules would move, let's say someone just sprayed something, perfume or whatever, and these are the molecules. And if you look, molecules are in this gradient, right? The concentration gradient. And they are going to move from an area of lower concentration of higher concentration to this area right here, which has lower concentration. So they'll kind of start moving around and spreading all over the place. Okay, so that's basically how diffusion works. It goes from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. Um, so, real quick to kind of summarize what we've done so far, we know that cells are constantly importing and exporting substances, and that in order for cells to constantly import and export substances without using energy, various processes such as osmosis and diffusion help move these substances. And we define passive transport as the movement of molecules across the cell membrane without using energy, and we just define diffusion as the movement of molecules in a fluid or gas form from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. Now, how would this work in our cells? Okay, so let's talk about that for a minute. So I'm going to read from your textbooks, and then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to write down the most important concept of what we just read. So let me just go ahead and clear this. If you guys have any doubts or need to read something, you can pause and rewind. In your books, it says, in cells, diffusion play an important role in moving substances across the membrane. Okay, so in cells, diffusion plays a or an excuse me plays an important role in moving substances across the cell membrane. And, and cells diffusion plays an important role in moving substances across the cell membranes. Okay, for example, lipids and carbon dioxide help substances such as small lipids, carbon dioxide, um, and oxygen easily. Sorry, guys, for a minute there, kind of froze. Okay, easily diffuse across the membrane. That means they easily pass across the membrane, and it's because the cells need some of these substances or need these substances in order to survive. So remember that the cell membrane is semi-permeable, so that means that when it says it easily moves across, is because there's a constant exchange. For example, there's always a constant exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide when we breathe. So it's important that the cell that these elements or that these substances, excuse me, pass through the membrane easily because we're breathing and it's involuntary. And if we needed energy to breathe, that would make it very very difficult for us to survive. So that's why passive transport, or that's why passive transport is so important. Excuse me, in the cell, in order for those substances to reach us, okay, to reach living organisms. Um, Here's something that I think is important. It says that most of our cells constantly consume oxygen. Okay, and right here, most of our cells constantly, most of our cells constantly um, use oxygen, consume oxygen, or use oxygen. I'll just use. I'll just write use. Consume oxygen. Most of our cells constantly consume oxygen. Um, and this means that oxygen concentrations are higher outside of the cell. Um, I'm sorry, are outside of the cell than inside of the cell. And what that means, of course, is that that's why our cells or oxygen needs to pass through the membrane so easily. So that's why diffusion in this case is so important, and it's so important to go from a higher area of higher concentration than an area uh, of lower concentration. So oxygen Oxygen enters cell membrane without. Oxygen enters the cell membrane without. Um, Oxygen enters the cell membrane without using energy. I'm sorry, guys. So that's very important to understand. So basically, diffusion, molecules move from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. In our cells, for example, that's important so that substances like small lipids or oxygen or carbon dioxide go across the cell membrane, especially oxygen, because our cells are constantly consuming oxygen. We are aerobic, which means that we thrive or we survive in the presence of oxygen. So that's why it's so important that oxygen molecules actually diffuse or pass through the cell membranes without any use of energy, because if not, that could be very, 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 very detrimental. So that brings us then to our next concept, and we're going to talk about osmosis. And osmosis is pretty much the process by which water molecules move. So diffusion it can be fluid molecules because lipids are not necessarily gas or are not gas, and oxygen is gas. So diffusion mainly works with molecules that are fluid, such as small lipids or oxygen. Diffuse osmosis basically works more with water molecules. So let me go ahead and erase this, and then I'll just read you guys the definition of osmosis, and I'll type it up here so you guys can take a look at it. So osmosis, it says water molecules, of course, also diffuse. They move across a semi-permeable membrane from an area of higher water concentration to an area of lower water concentration. This process is called osmosis. It is important to recognize that the higher concentration of dissolved particles in a solution, it is important to recognize, excuse me, that the higher the concentration of dissolved particles in a solution, the lower the concentration of water molecules in the same solution. So let's go ahead and define osmosis. Basically, it's same thing as diffusion, but diffusion works more with the area of gas or other fluids. Osmosis mainly works with water, and of course, the cell lives in an aqueous or an environment where water is present. So let's go ahead and define osmosis. It says is the movement across a semi-permeable membrane. Osmosis is the movement of water across a semi-permeable permeable membrane. Remember that our cell membranes are semi-permeable. There are certain molecules that they let in and certain molecules that do not enter the cell. So osmosis is the movement of water across a semi-permeable membrane from an area of higher concentration of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. Okay? From an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. Okay, so osmosis is the same as diffusion. They move from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration, but it's mainly working with water. And um, so let's talk about types of solutions. Okay, so and I'm gonna read this to you guys. Although again, we kind of discussed this in class, but just so you guys have a reference. And again, it says it is important to recognize that the higher the concentration of dissolved particles in a solution, the lower the concentration of water molecules in the same solution. So if you put 1 teaspoon of salt in a cup of water and 10 teaspoons of salt in a different cup, of water, the first cup would have the higher water concentration. Okay, so basically, if, and I'm going to try to illustrate this as best as I can. So if we have a cup, and that cup, and let me see if I can, with my awesome drawings on the Zoom board, let's see if I can actually go ahead and kind of draw something remotely similar to a cup. And let's, of course, water is in this cup. And we have water in the cup. And I have, if I put 1 teaspoon of salt in this water, or this glass of water, I know salt is usually white, but if I draw white here, you're not gonna be able to see what I'm trying to illustrate. So let's say I put a salt in this water, right? 1 teaspoon of salt. See if I can draw a spoon. Okay, so that's my version of a spoon. So there's 1 teaspoon of salt. 1 teaspoon of salt in a glass of water still means that there's going to be more water than salt in this cup. So basically, we're going to talk about what would happen if I had substances that were hypotonic, isotonic, or hypertonic. And what that means is that where there would either be more water outside of a cell than inside of a cell, or more water inside of a cell than outside of a cell, or balance. And I know that makes no sense, but basically what that's saying is that if you put a teaspoon in a glass of water, just 1 teaspoon of salt in a glass of water, there's still going to be more water than salt. But what if I put 10 teaspoons of salt in that water? Then that would be different, right? So that's what they're trying to, the book is trying to illustrate. So let's define isotonic, hypotonic, and all these things. The first thing we're going to talk about is an isotonic solution. And an isotonic solution, guys, basically has the same concentration of dissolved particles as the cell. Okay, an isotonic solution in a cell, an isotonic solution in a cell has the same concentration of dissolved particles has the same concentration of dissolved particles as the cell. And what this means is that water molecules move into and out of the cells into out of the cells at an equal rate. So the cell's size does not change. So basically, when you have an isotonic solution, that means that the cell has the same water inside than outside, and that water is constantly going in and out of the cell at the same rate, at the same time, or at the same speed, or at the same rate. And there's no big changes. And what that does is it maintains the cell size the same. But what if we talk about different types of solution? What if we talk about a hypertonic solution? Okay, so let's talk about a hypertonic solution. So we'll say that a hypertonic solution solution has higher concentration of dissolved particles, a higher concentration of dissolved particles, has a higher concentration of dissolved particles than a cell. So basically, this means this means that there is a higher concentration of water, higher concentration of water. There's a higher concentration of water inside the cell. There is a higher concentration of water inside the cell than outside. So what happens here is that water moves outside of the cell. Water moves outside of the cell. Let's see if I can move this so you guys can see that a little better. There we go. So basically what's happening here is that water molecules, water moves outside of the cell, causing it to shrivel. So again, when we have a hypertonic solution, a higher concentration of dissolved particle, a hypertonic solution. I'm sorry, I realized that I just did not write a word. Has a higher concentration of dissolved particles um, than a cell. There you go. So a hypertonic solution has a higher concentration of dissolved particles than a cell. This means that there is a higher concentration of water inside of the cell than outside, and then water moves outside of the cell, causing it to shrivel. So basically, when a cell is in a hypertonic solution, that means that there's more water inside than outside, and what happens is that it starts to eliminate water, and this has to there has to be an equilibrium, because if there isn't, then that's going to cause the cell to die. Okay, so, plant cells have a cell wall, and which makes it rigid, and we're gonna talk about that in a minute, but there are ways in which a cell can avoid having this, so or letting this occur is what I'm trying to say. So again, hypertonic solution, there is more water more water inside of the cell than outside, so basically the water starts to move outside, and it has to stop because otherwise the cell is going to shrivel up, and that's something that we want to avoid. And the last thing that we're going to talk about now is a hypotonic solution. So let me move this bar down here, and let's talk about a hypotonic solution. Okay, so a hypotonic solution, or in a hypotonic solution, hypotonic solution has a lower concentration has a lower concentration of dissolved particles of dissolved particles has a lower concentration of dissolved particles than a cell. This means water molecules are more concentrated outside than inside. Water molecules are more concentrated outside than inside. And um, and what happens is that in this case, water diffuses into the cell. That means that there's more water outside than inside, and water diffuses into the cell, causing it to expand. Okay, so we've talked about diffusion, we've talked about osmosis. Osmosis referring more to water, diffusion referring more to gas, particles, or other fluids. And both of them, or both of these of the movements of molecules into the cell, do not require energy. There is one more that we're going to talk about, which is called facilitated diffusion. Okay, and facilitated diffusion. Diffusion. Basically, facilitated diffusion is the diffusion of molecules across the membrane of water molecules across the membrane is a diffusion of water molecules across the membrane or the membrane through transport proteins. Okay, through transport proteins. Now, the word facilitates means to make easier. So that means that transport proteins basically make it easier for certain molecules to pass or to enter or exit a cell. Okay, so again, it's basically the same way that diffusion works with water, but in this case, there's a transport protein, and that transport protein basically just helps water move. So let's see if I can illustrate this to you guys, and see if we can if I can help illustrate the point better. We have a cell, and basically, and this is a very rough drawing and a very rough illustration, but there are proteins, and these proteins basically recognize a particular type of model. So if it's a big, not model, molecule. So if it's a big molecule or just a different type of molecule, what these proteins would do is that they're gonna trap or recognize it, and then they're just gonna help the molecule just pass across the membrane. So that's basically what facilitated diffusion is. Is basically transport proteins that help certain molecules get into or out of the cell. Okay, and they require no energy, so that's why they're still part of passive transport. So guys, hopefully this video will help you understand this a little better. And until we see each other in our next class, stay safe. Bye.